The emergency room smelled wrong that night. Not the usual sharp tang of antiseptic and latex gloves, but something thicker, heavier, the kind of stench that clings to your hair and your clothes no matter how quickly you walk past it. Nurses glanced at each other over their masks, eyes wide, as a woman in her late 40s was rushed in on a gurney. Her skin was slick with sweat, her hands clawing at the rails, but it was the odor that made seasoned doctors stop mid-step. It was the smell of death, but not the quiet kind, the kind that comes suddenly, violently, from deep inside a living body. She was whispering through clenched teeth, her voice raw. "It's inside me. It's eating me." The sheets beneath her were already stained, not with blood, but with something darker, a liquid that seemed to rot the air around it. And when the nurse peeled back the gown to assess the damage, she froze. At first, she thought her eyes were deceiving her, but then the flashlight confirmed it. Tiny, pale, writhing bodies, maggots crawling out from wounds that hadn't even broken the surface the day before. Someone gagged. A resident fled to the hall, pressing both hands to his mouth. Even the ER director, who had seen car crashes, gunshot wounds, and battlefield injuries, whispered a single word under his breath. Impossible. Because bodies don't do this. Not without weeks of decay. Not while the heart is still beating. And yet here she was alive, begging them to help. The monitors beeped in frantic sync with her pulse. Every attempt at comfort, ice chips, morphine, oxygen, barely registered. She kept asking for her husband, but he wasn't there. Nobody knew where he was. Only hours earlier, she had walked into the hospital on her own, doubled over in pain, but still steady enough to drive. Now she was crumbling right in front of them. One nurse leaned in close and asked the obvious, "How long has this been happening?" The woman's eyes fluttered open, glassy with tears. "Since Ghana," she whispered. The syllables seemed to drain what little strength she had left. "Since I married him." The room went quiet. It didn't take long for whispers to spread through the ER staff. An American woman, newly returned from a whirlwind marriage in Africa, her body rotting from the inside out. Some of the younger nurses muttered about parasites, rare tropical infections. But others, older ones who had grown up in small towns with their own folk stories, spoke in lower tones. Curses, rituals, blood vows that followed you across oceans. The doctors did what they always do, ordered tests, paged specialists, started antibiotics, but none of it touched the source. Every scan, every lab result came back stranger than the last. Necrotizing tissue that refused to respond. Infections with no identifiable bacteria, organs shutting down as if something unseen was consuming them. They could treat the symptoms, but the disease, or whatever this was, slipped through every crack of their knowledge. In the waiting room, her family arrived, frantic and confused. They kept repeating the same thing. She had been fine a month ago. She had come home from her trip glowing, younger somehow. With a new husband from Ghana, she seemed both enchanted by and oddly secretive about. They hadn't known much about him, just that the wedding had been sudden, wrapped in strange tribal ceremonies that none of them had attended. And now, only weeks later, she was lying in an American hospital bed, her body unraveling in ways that felt more like folklore than medicine. As midnight pressed against the ER windows, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just another medical case. This was a mystery, one that stretched far beyond the fluorescent lights of the hospital. Was this the revenge of a parasite science hadn't yet named? Was it something her husband had done to her? An act of cruelty hidden beneath vows and rituals? Or was it, as some whispered with genuine fear, a curse carried across the ocean, waiting for the moment it would collect its due? The woman's screams echoed down the hall. every cry pulling doctors and nurses back to her bedside. And in those moments, as her body betrayed her cell by cell, the unspoken question grew heavier. What exactly had followed her back from Ghana? Before the chaos, before the hospital lights, and the unbearable stench, she had been someone ordinary. Her name wasn't on the front page of any newspaper, and her neighbors in a quiet Midwestern town would have described her as reliable, polite, maybe even a little lonely. She was 48, worked a steady job at a local insurance firm, and spent her evenings watching cooking shows with a glass of wine. To her coworkers, she was the woman who always brought in homemade brownies for birthdays, the one who remembered everyone's kids' names. But beneath that polite, dependable exterior, there was a gnawing emptiness she could no longer ignore. She had been divorced for nearly a decade. The marriage had ended quietly, not in a fiery explosion, but in a slow erosion. Two people drifting until there was nothing left to hold on to. Since then, she had tried dating apps, church mixers, even a brief relationship with a neighbor that fizzled out before it began. Time had a way of sneaking up on her. 40 had turned to 45, then closer to 50, and every birthday candle seemed to whisper the same word: alone. Friends tried to fill the gaps. Weekend brunches, book clubs, occasional road trips. But at night, when the house went quiet and the TV clicked off, she felt the hollow spaces most sharply. She would scroll through Instagram, watching younger coworkers show off their vacations, engagements, their forever homes. More than once, she caught herself staring at photos of beaches, markets, or strangers dancing under foreign skies. Maybe, she thought, if she couldn't find happiness here, she might stumble across it somewhere far away. That's what sparked the trip to Africa. It started as a dare to herself. She had always been cautious, careful, the kind of woman who paid bills on time and never colored outside the lines. But she was tired of being careful. One evening, over a second glass of wine, she clicked book now on a travel package to Ghana. Safari tours, cultural excursions, and village stays. It promised an authentic experience she wasn't even sure she was ready for. Still, something inside her stirred. Maybe this was how she would outrun the silence that had settled over her life. Her family thought it was impulsive, out of character. Her sister warned her to be careful over there, while her grown niece half-joked about horror stories she'd seen online. But she laughed it off. It's just 2 weeks. A vacation. Something different, she said. What she didn't say was that she hoped for more than sightseeing. She hoped for a story. In the weeks leading up to her trip, she seemed brighter. Coworkers noticed the new dresses she bought, the way she had her hair done differently, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about finally doing something for myself. For once, she wasn't the background character in other people's lives. She was the one setting the stage. The day she boarded her flight, she carried only one suitcase and a passport she hadn't used in years. At the gate, she texted her sister, "Don't worry. I'll be fine. Who knows? Maybe I'll come back with something worth talking about." No one could have known how prophetic those words would be. Because when she stepped off the plane in Accra, the humid air heavy with spices and dust, her life was already bending towards something she couldn't see. The streets, the markets, the music, it all felt like the opening chapter of a story she had been waiting her whole life to read. She thought she was chasing adventure. What she didn't realize was that adventure was about to chase her back, and it would follow her all the way home. She first noticed him at the edge of a village celebration, where drums pounded against the night air and firelight painted everything in flickering gold. She had joined the tour group reluctantly for this cultural immersion event, expecting stage dances for tourists and souvenir stalls. But what she stepped into felt older, heavier, like stepping into a story that had been told for centuries before she arrived. Men and women in bright, Kent cloth moved in unison, stamping feet against the packed earth, their voices rising in chants that made her skin prickle. Smoke from a fire mixed with the sweet burn of palm wine, and children laughed as they darted between the dancers. And then him, tall, broad-shouldered, with skin glistening in the firelight. He moved differently than the others, slower, more deliberate, as though every step carried meaning. He wasn't just performing. He was commanding the space. His eyes, sharp and steady, scanned the crowd, and for one suspended moment, they landed on her. The look held, longer than polite, long enough to make her heart stumble in her chest. Later, when the formal part of the ritual ended and the tourists were ushered toward tables of food, he approached. His English was accented but smooth, his smile warm but edged with something she couldn't quite place. Confidence, mystery, danger? He introduced himself as Kojo. He asked where she was from, and when she answered, America, his grin widened. Then maybe tonight, America meets Ghana. They walked together along the outskirts of the village while music still pulsed behind them. He told her stories of his people, of ancestors who spoke through dreams, of healers who bound lovers together with talismans carved from bone. She laughed nervously, unsure whether he was teasing, but his voice carried such gravity that she felt drawn in despite herself. He wore a leather cord around his neck with a carved symbol that he claimed had been passed down through generations. At one point, he took it off and placed it gently in her palm. To protect you, he said, closing her fingers over it. She felt a chill, though the night was hot. Over the next days, he kept reappearing. At the market, guiding her through stalls of spices and fabrics. On the dirt paths leading to waterfalls tourists rarely visited. He seemed to know exactly when to step out of the crowd, as though fate itself kept threading their paths together. Other women in the group noticed, whispering with raised brows, but she didn't care. For the first time in years, she felt alive, seen, wanted. Their connection grew faster than she expected, faster than it should have. By the end of the first week, she found herself sneaking away from her hotel to meet him in the quiet hours, where lantern light softened his face and his stories turned more intimate. He spoke of destiny, of spirits that had chosen them. He pressed her hand to his chest and whispered that their lives were now bound. When the idea of marriage came, it didn't arrive as a question, but as a certainty. The village prepared a ceremony. There was chanting, smoke, blood from a slaughtered goat sprinkled at their feet, and a talisman, 2 bones tied together with red thread that he tied around her wrist. The tourists from her group didn't attend. This was no stage performance. This was private, sacred. She stood before him, the drums pounding like a second heartbeat, and said yes without hesitation. Later, when she called her sister back home, her voice was glowing, giddy, almost unrecognizable. I met someone, she said. We're married. It's real. You wouldn't understand until you see it. Her sister was stunned into silence. Friends thought she had lost her mind, but she didn't care. In her mind, she had finally stepped out of the grayness of her old life and into something extraordinary. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that this extraordinary love story carried shadows she couldn't yet see. Shadows that would follow her across an ocean. When she stepped off the plane back in the States, she wasn't alone. He followed just a few steps behind, his tall frame wrapped in a simple jacket that looked too light for the chill of an American autumn. She pulled her suitcase with one hand and clutched his with the other, beaming as if she'd brought home the most precious souvenir of her life. To her, that's exactly what he was, proof that she had finally broken free of the smallness that had haunted her for years. Her family was waiting at the arrival's gate, holding cardboard coffee cups and 4 smiles. They had heard about the whirlwind marriage over a shaky international phone call, but seeing him in person was something else. Her sister's eyebrows climbed higher than she meant them to, and her nephew whispered under his breath, "He looks intense." But she ignored the tension. She wrapped her husband's arm around hers and announced proudly, "This is Kojo. This is my husband." The ride home was awkward. Her sister made small talk about the weather, about traffic, about the long flight, but Kojo barely answered. He stared out the window, his dark eyes reflecting the blur of highways and gas stations. When he did speak, his words were short, deliberate, as though he were measuring what belonged to him and what didn't in this new world. In the weeks that followed, her friends and co-workers reacted with thinly veiled disbelief. Some congratulated her warmly, but traded looks the moment she turned away. Others asked blunt questions. "How well do you really know him?" That left her bristling. She defended him at every turn, insisting that love didn't need years of background checks and slow dance courtships. "It's different with him," she said, her eyes blazing in a way they hadn't in years. But beneath the fairy tale glow, cracks began to show. Kojo rarely left the house. He didn't apply for work, didn't seem interested in exploring the city. Instead, he spent hours in their bedroom with a small wooden box he had carried from Ghana, carved with strange symbols she couldn't translate. At night, she sometimes woke to the sound of his low chanting, words that rolled sharp and guttural, almost like prayers or warnings. When she asked about it, he only smiled faintly and said, "It keeps us safe." Neighbors noticed his presence too. The couple next door swore they saw him burying something by the fence one night, moving quietly with a jar in his hands. Another claimed they heard the rhythm of drums drifting from the house when she was away at work. By the time gossip made its way through the neighborhood, the story had twisted into something darker. The new husband was into voodoo, doing rituals not right, and yet she clung to him. She introduced him proudly at the office holiday party, though he stood silent in the corner, his expression unreadable. She showed off photos from their village wedding, the colors, the drums, the talisman on her wrist. Most people smiled politely, but she could feel the undercurrent of doubt. She hated that doubt almost as much as she feared losing the one thing that had made her feel alive again. Still, there were moments that unsettled her. When she reached for his box, he snatched it away with a sharpness she had never seen before. When she mentioned planning a trip with her sister, his jaw tightened, and he said, "Your place is here, with me." And sometimes, when the room was quiet and she caught him staring, there was a heaviness in his eyes that made her wonder if she truly knew the man she had married. But love, or something close to it, makes excuses. She told herself he was just adjusting to a new country, a new culture. She told herself the whispers didn't matter, that what they had was bigger than anyone else's opinion. What she didn't tell herself, what she couldn't let herself believe, was that the shadows from that Ghanaian village might have followed them home. It started small, so small she almost brushed it off. A faint burning deep inside, the kind of discomfort most women chalk up to something ordinary, a yeast infection, maybe a reaction to the new soap she'd bought. She mentioned it casually one night as they sat on the couch, but Kojo only tilted his head and said, "The body adjusts to new beginnings." His voice carried no concern, as if pain were just a part of love. At first, she did what anyone would do. She booked an appointment with her gynecologist, expecting antibiotics, a cream, something simple. The doctor ran tests, found mild inflammation, nothing alarming, and sent her home with medication. She felt reassured, but only for a while. Within days, the burning grew sharper, more insistent. Then came the discharge, dark, foul-smelling, unlike anything she had experienced before. She threw the medicine in the trash, convinced the doctor had missed something. By the second week, she could barely ignore it. At work, she shifted in her chair, trying to hide the grimace every time the pain pulsed through her. Her coworkers noticed she was quieter, distracted, her usual spark dulled. At night, she lay awake while Kojo slept soundly beside her. Sometimes she thought she heard him murmuring in his sleep, words she didn't understand, as though he were speaking to someone she couldn't see. The first true moment of horror came one morning in the bathroom. She felt a crawling sensation, like something alive, and when she looked down, she saw it, a tiny white larva wriggling against her skin. Her scream rattled the walls. She scrubbed herself raw in the shower, sobbing, gagging, unable to believe what she had seen. When she tried to tell Kojo, he stared at her with unsettling calm. "Don't speak of it," he said. "Some things grow before they die." Her hand shook as she called the clinic again, demanding an urgent appointment. The nurse on the other end grew silent when she described what she had found, then gently suggested she might be mistaken. The doctor examined her again, found signs of necrosis, tissue dying faster than it should, but no parasites, no infection that fit any known profile. He ordered stronger antibiotics, took cultures, promised to call when the results came back. But the results only confused them further. Nothing matched. The smell came next. At first faint, like something sour left too long in the trash. Then stronger, thicker, clinging to her clothes, her sheets, even the air of her home. No matter how many showers she took, no matter how hard she scrubbed the bathroom tiles with bleach, the odor followed her. Her sister visited one afternoon and recoiled, covering her mouth. "What is that smell?" she asked, her eyes wide. She didn't have an answer. Her world shrank quickly. She stopped going to work, too ashamed to sit in meetings while colleagues shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to notice. She avoided friends, terrified they would catch the scent she couldn't escape. Her days became a cycle of pain, panic, and hopelessness. And through it all, Kojo grew colder, slipping out of the house for hours at a time, refusing to look at her directly. When she pressed him, desperate for support, he only said, "You carry what was given. I cannot take it away." By the end of that month, she no longer recognized herself in the mirror. Her skin was pale, her eyes sunken, her body weakened. But it was the look in her own eyes that terrified her most, because beneath the pain, beneath the fear, there was a dawning realization she couldn't push aside. This wasn't just an infection. This wasn't just bad luck. Something far darker was happening to her, and she was running out of time to stop it. By the time she staggered into the emergency room, she was barely able to walk on her own. The nurses caught her under the arms, guiding her to a bed, but even before they touched her, the smell hit them. It wasn't like anything they had encountered before. Not the sterile tang of blood, not the sour odor of infection. It was heavier, putrid, the unmistakable stench of something rotting, something that should have been buried in the ground. Except she was still alive. She clutched her abdomen, moaning through clenched teeth, her voice breaking into gasps. The sheets beneath her grew damp with discharge that seeped through her clothes, staining everything it touched. When a resident on call pulled back the gown to examine her, he froze. What he saw made his breath catch, strips of tissue turning black, eaten away in patches, and crawling among them, maggots alive, writhing as if feeding on her still-living body. The young doctor stumbled back, his mask suddenly useless against the stench. A nurse gagged, another whispered, "Oh my God." Even in an ER where gunshot wounds and car crashes rolled nightly, this scene was something else. Something that didn't belong in a living person. They rushed her into isolation. A team of specialists was paged, surgeons, infectious disease experts, even a tropical medicine consultant from across town. Monitors beeped frantically as they pumped her with 4 fluids, broad-spectrum antibiotics, morphine for the pain. None of it seemed to matter. Every hour, the necrosis spread farther, climbing across her thighs, deeper into her abdomen, as though her own body was turning against her. A surgeon suggested emergency debridement, cutting away the dead flesh to stop the spread. They wheeled her into the operating room, masks tight, scalpels ready. But when they began, the tissue came away too easily, as though it wanted to detach itself, and underneath was only more decay. The smell was so overpowering that one nurse fainted. Another vomited behind her mask. After hours, they had removed more than anyone thought survivable, and still the infection advanced. Back in recovery, she drifted in and out of consciousness, begging them to stop the pain. Her voice was hoarse, desperate. She asked for her husband repeatedly, but he never came. One nurse finally whispered to a colleague, "Where is he? Why isn't he here?" No one had an answer. Meanwhile, the hospital staff grew restless. Some insisted it was a bizarre, aggressive bacterial strain, something rare and poorly understood. Others whispered darker theories in the break room. Parasites that had hitched a ride from overseas, a ritual curse that medicine couldn't touch. A few even refused to re-enter her room, shaken to their core by the sight of a living woman decomposing before their eyes. The family gathered in the waiting room, their faces pale, their voices trembling. They clutched one another as the doctors explained the grim prognosis. "We're doing everything we can," they said, but the words rang hollow. There was no case study to point to, no treatment protocol that offered hope. She was dying, and science couldn't stop it. Through the glass of the ICU, her sister pressed her hand to the window, watching as the machines beeped and the woman on the bed writhed in agony. She mouthed the same words over and over, "Hold on. Please hold on." But everyone who saw her knew the truth. Whatever had begun inside her wasn't stopping. It was consuming her piece by piece, and no one, not the surgeons, not the specialists, not even the prayers whispered outside her room, could slow it down. In the hallways of that hospital, people spoke in hushed voices. Some said it was the most terrifying case they had ever seen. Others, more superstitious, lowered their eyes and muttered one word under their breath: "Curse." The story didn't stay inside the hospital walls for long. By the second day, whispers had already reached the local newsrooms. A middle-aged American woman, recently married to a man from Ghana, was fighting for her life in an ICU while her body quite literally rotted from within. It was the kind of headline that demanded attention, and soon it was everywhere, on late-night broadcasts, in online tabloids, shared across Facebook feeds with captions like "Bride of Africa's Curse." Neighbors were the first to feed the fire. They spoke to reporters on their porches, still wide-eyed as they described the odd sights and sound from the couple's house in the weeks since his arrival. One swore she'd seen him digging in the yard at night, burying jars and muttering words in a language she didn't recognize. Another claimed she'd heard drums, actual drums, coming from inside their home long after midnight. Whether true or twisted by fear, the story spread like gasoline on an open flame. Online forums and podcasts quickly picked it up. Some armchair experts leaned on science, rare necrotizing infections, flesh-eating bacteria, parasites carried over from tropical climates. Others leaned towards superstition. Comment sections brimmed with theories of curses, witchcraft, or juju rituals sealed during her village wedding. One viral tweet read, "She married him in a blood ceremony." What did she expect? Hashtags trended. Hashtag rotting bride. Hashtag curse or crime. Hashtag African hex. Inside the hospital, the doctors tried to hold the line of science. Press conferences framed it as a highly unusual infectious case under investigation. Infectious disease specialists debated whether it could be a mutated strain of Clostridium or an undetected parasitic infestation. Yet privately, even the most rational among them admitted they'd never seen anything like it. Antibiotics failed. Cultures revealed nothing consistent. And every day, her body slipped further away. Her family, meanwhile, became divided. Her sister pleaded with the doctors to find something, anything, while her brother insisted the husband knew more than he was saying. Why hadn't he been at her bedside? Why did he disappear for hours at a time? When reporters finally cornered him in the hospital parking lot, his answer only fueled suspicion. He said quietly, "She carries what was given to her. It cannot be undone." The soundbite looped endlessly on the evening news, framed with ominous music and slow-motion footage of the hospital entrance. To the public, it sounded less like grief and more like confession. Was he admitting to poisoning her? To binding her with some ritual no one in America could understand? Religious leaders weighed in too. A local pastor warned his congregation against demonic influences from pagan lands. A Ghanaian cultural group pushed back, furious at the stereotyping of their traditions, insisting this was a medical tragedy being twisted into xenophobia. The clash only deepened the frenzy. By the third week, the case wasn't just a local curiosity, it was a national debate. Morning talk shows invited medical experts alongside anthropologists. One host asked bluntly, "Are we dealing with science here, or superstition?" And when the camera cut to her photo, a smiling woman holding hand with her husband in a Ghanaian village, the screen split with two captions: "Victim of disease" on one side, "Victim of curse" on the other. In the waiting room, her family huddled, watching it all unfold on the news feed above the vending machines. They didn't know what to believe anymore. All they knew was that the woman they loved was slipping away, and the man she had married, the man who was supposed to protect her, stood apart from them, silent, unreadable, as if he already knew how this story would end. The end came faster than anyone expected. One night, just after 3 a.m., the monitors in her ICU room began to scream. Nurses rushed in, only to find her body convulsing, her skin clammy, her breath shallow and ragged. They worked frantically, compressions, epinephrine, another round of intubation, but every push felt like trying to hold back a tidal wave with bare hands. The infection had reached too far, consuming organs, bloodstream, everything. Within minutes, her heart flatlined. The doctors called the time of death at 3:27 a.m. The room fell still, except for the soft hiss of the ventilator winding down. One nurse, who had held her hand during her last lucid hour, slipped the talisman from her wrist and set it on the bedside table. She couldn't bring herself to keep it against the body. Even after all she had witnessed, the object felt heavy, dangerous somehow, as though it still carried a story no one dared to speak. Her sister arrived moments later, her face streaked with tears. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, whispering her sibling's name again and again, unwilling to accept that the woman she'd grown up with, the one who used to braid her hair and share secrets under the covers, was gone in such a grotesque, unexplainable way. The rest of the family followed, collapsing into each other's arms, their grief punctuated by disbelief. How could this happen here? In America? With all our medicine, with all our doctors? The official report offered little comfort. The medical examiner described rapidly progressive necrotizing infection of unknown origin. No single bacterium, no parasite, no toxin could be pinned down as the culprit. It was a mystery in clinical language, stamped with a cold seal of bureaucracy. And then there was Kojo. For days, he had kept to himself in the hospital's dim corners, silent while her family pleaded for answers. But after her death, he vanished completely. He didn't attend the meeting with the medical examiner. He didn't come to the funeral home to make arrangements. By the time the family gathered to plan her burial, he was simply gone, his phone disconnected, his belongings missing from their shared house. It was as though he had evaporated into the air, leaving behind only questions and whispers. The funeral itself was subdued, closed casket. The smell, even in death, had never truly lifted. Friends from her office filled the pews, murmuring in shock. A pastor spoke of mystery, of faith, of life's unanswered questions. But behind the platitudes, the air was heavy with unease. Many mourners glanced toward the empty spot where her husband should have been, the absence louder than any sermon. Outside the church, reporters clustered, shoving microphones at family members. Do you believe she was cursed? Where is the husband now? Will there be an investigation? Her sister pushed through them with red eyes and trembling hands, muttering only she didn't deserve this. And then silence. After the burial, after the last handful of dirt hit the coffin, the world moved on. The headlines faded, replaced by fresher scandals. The hospital filed the case away as unresolved. Police never named a suspect, never issued a warrant. And without a body of evidence, or a husband to question, the story of the rotting bride slipped into the quiet corner of true crime lore, a half-forgotten mystery whispered about on late-night forums and campfire podcasts. For her family, though, the silence was deafening. They were left with grief, with shame, with a gnawing uncertainty that would never let them rest. Science had no answers. Faith offered no comfort. And the one man who might have known the truth had disappeared into the wind. Her death didn't close the story. If anything, it cracked it wide open. Within days, talk shows and podcasts had seized on the case, each spinning their own version of what had happened. Some framed it as a medical mystery, a tragic example of how little we truly know about rare tropical diseases. Others leaned hard into the darker angle. A curse carried across an ocean, sealed in a ritual wedding, now claiming its due. The headlines wrote themselves. Bride returns from Ghana, body-rotting mystery. Love, rituals, and death. The case of the American woman who married too quickly. Cable news ran panel debates with infectious disease experts on one side and cultural anthropologists on the other. One doctor insisted it was an aggressive form of necrotizing fasciitis, a bacteria moving faster than any recorded strain. Across from him, a folklorist argued that in certain West African traditions, marriage rites could include spiritual bindings that, if broken or betrayed, led to physical decay. The split screen made for great television, even if it offered no real answers. Online, the story became a wildfire. The hashtags refused to die. Hashtag rotting bride. Hashtag curse or crime. Hashtag Hex in America. TikTok creators reenacted her hospital screams in dimly lit rooms, while Reddit threads dissected every reported detail. The talisman she wore, the husband's cryptic remarks, the neighbor's claims of late-night chanting. Some users argued it was clear-cut homicide. He poisoned her, maybe slipped her something at the wedding. Others were convinced it was supernatural. Science can't explain maggots in living flesh. This was witchcraft. Her family pushed for answers. They begged the authorities to investigate Kojo, who had vanished without trace. For weeks, they called police departments, filed reports, even contacted the FBI. An agent met with them briefly, acknowledging the strangeness, but reminding them there was no physical evidence linking the husband to her death. Without a suspect, without proof of foul play, it was impossible to move forward. That only fueled speculation. Was he hiding in another state? Did he return quietly to Ghana? Or worse, was he still in America, protected by the very curse people feared he carried? Every sighting became a rumor, Every dark-skinned man in town eyed with suspicion, drawing criticism from activists who condemned the racialized hysteria the case was feeding. Meanwhile, the medical community stayed divided. Some specialists published papers suggesting new strains of flesh-eating disease, calling the case a biological outlier. Others dismissed it outright as media sensationalism. Yet behind closed doors, many admitted the truth. They didn't know what killed her. No culture had grown a pathogen that matched. No treatment had slowed it down. It was, in every sense of the word, unexplainable. Months later, the case still haunted headlines. A popular podcast devoted a 3-part series titled Bride of the Rotting Curse, drawing millions of listeners. True crime YouTubers picked apart the timeline, filling thumbnails with grim photos of village ceremonies and glowing eyes in the dark. For her family, each upload was another wound. They wanted justice, not entertainment. But justice never came. The husband's name faded from official records. The hospital filed its last report, and the world moved on to the next spectacle. What lingered was the debate. Was she the victim of science's limits, of a husband's sinister betrayal, or of something older than either? Something carried in chance and blood, something that doesn't die when the body does. Her grave became a small pilgrimage site for the curious. Strangers left flowers, coins, even notes asking for protection from curses of their own. Some nights, candles flickered against the headstone, their wax pooled like melted prayers. And always the same question hung in the air, unanswered, unanswerable. Did she die of disease, or of something no hospital will ever be able to name? On a quiet afternoon weeks after the funeral, the cemetery was almost empty. A single stone stood freshly set among older graves, its polished surface catching the last light of the sun. The inscription was simple, stripped of all the noise and speculation. Beloved sister, gone too soon. Her family gathered there often. Her sister came with flowers, sometimes sitting for hours in silence, sometimes whispering into the wind as if answers might drift back. The question still clawed at her. What really happened? Where her brother-in-law had gone? Why medicine had failed so completely? None of it made sense, and the silence from the world around her was almost worse than the tragedy itself. Life in the town slowly moved on, but the story never truly left. Neighbors lowered their voices when they passed the house where the couple had lived. The wooden fence remained, the yard unkempt, the windows dark. Some swore they still saw candles flickering inside night. Others claimed the box Kojo carried had been buried somewhere on the property, a secret waiting to be unearthed. Online, her death became legend. Podcasts dissected her case like a puzzle that could be solved if only one more clue surfaced. On YouTube, her name was tied to thumbnails of blood-red titles and ominous music. Every theory lived on. Parasite, poisoning, curse, fueled by the mystery of a husband who vanished into thin air. For strangers, it was entertainment. For her family, it was a wound that refused to heal. Her sister sometimes scrolled through those videos late at night, watching strangers argue over whether her loved one had been cursed or murdered. She wanted to scream that behind the hashtags and clickbait, there had been a real woman, someone who laughed at sitcom reruns, who loved chocolate cake, who once cried over a silly romance movie on a Friday night. But the world had already claimed the story for itself, and there was no taking it back. In the end, there were no answers, just the grave, the silence, and the echo of a warning she had once brushed off, that some vows, once spoken, carry a weight you cannot return. And now she was gone, leaving behind only questions that no one dared to ask out loud. The candlelight vigils eventually stopped. The news cameras moved on. But under the earth, where her body rested, the mystery remained. And for those who knew her best, the story was not one of curses or pathogens, but of love that led her too far, too fast, into a darkness no one could save her from.